Welcome to What Caused the Civil War?
An interactive U.S. history tutorial for students like you.
You probably know that the Civil War divided America like no other conflict in our nation's history. But do you know how it began, and more importantly, why? Americans still struggle to define this issue today. By the end of this tutorial, you should understand what the Civil War was and when and where it took place. You'll better understand the issues that led Americans to war and which ones were most central to causing the conflict. The Civil War, America's bloodiest conflict, raged for 4 long years, from 1861 to 1865. During that time, our nation was divided into two: the United States, or Union, seen here in blue, and the Confederate States, or Confederacy, seen here in red. A civil war is different from other wars because the people of a nation are fighting one another instead of a foreign enemy. People often talk about the Civil War in terms of North versus South, but that isn't entirely accurate. Not all the states considered Southern joined the Confederacy. Several remained loyal to the United States. For this reason, we'll describe the war in terms of the Union versus the Confederacy. Let's compare the two sides so you know the basics. 25 states made up the Union during the war years. These states had a population of about 21 million people at the time. Abraham Lincoln led the Union through the entire war as president and commander-in-chief. Many generals led the Union war effort, but the best known, and the one who brought the war to a successful conclusion, was Ulysses S. Grant. 11 states made up the Confederacy. These states had a far smaller population of about 9 million, but more than a third of those people were African American slaves. The Confederacy elected its own president, Jefferson Davis. Its most famous and successful general was Robert E. Lee. The United States, which began its nationhood in 1776 after declaring independence from Great Britain, enjoyed tremendous success in its first century. The territory, population, and wealth of the new nation expanded beyond the dreams of its founding fathers. But the northern and southern parts of the new country had significant differences in their cultures, economies, and populations. Over time, Northerners and Southerners became alienated from one another, almost coming to feel like they lived in two different nations. North and South historically disagreed over political issues like taxes, tariffs on trades, and the funding of national improvements like roads, bridges, and railroads. States' rights was another issue on which the North and South disagreed. Generally, Northerners were more comfortable with a stronger, more active federal government, while Southerners preferred to keep power in the governments of their states. There were exceptions to this, though. One central issue, however, came to dominate American politics, especially in the years leading up to the Civil War. That issue was slavery. Slavery had originally been legal in the entire United States, although it had always been rarer in the North. But by the 1800s, the practice was legal only in the southern states. Northern states had banned it by law. Cotton was a southern crop, and the cotton boom of the early 19th century made slave labor more valuable than ever to the South's economy. To illustrate this point, understand that by 1860, the 4 million black Americans enslaved in the South represented the most valuable possessions owned by anyone in the United States. Their dollar value was worth more than all the factories and railroads in the North combined. Not only was slavery big business, but it became a fundamental part of the identity and social order of the South. Many Southerners came to view slavery as their peculiar institution, the unique feature of their culture that made it superior, they believed, to that of the North. Because of this, Southern politicians became determined to expand slavery to the new Western territories that had become part of the U.S. in the 1840s. Slaves in America led generally wretched lives and had no control of their fate or that of their families. They could be bought and sold for any reason, and family members could be separated at any time. Slaves worked under constant threat of violence, and they were kept ignorant and illiterate, unable to read or write, by law. Some slaves managed to escape or rebel, but successful attempts to do so were rare. In the North, a growing number of people known as abolitionists wanted to see an immediate end to slavery. In the 1850s, a new political party, the Republicans, formed in the North. Their party platform called for an end to slavery's expansion, but not slavery itself. They wanted no new slave states created from the Western territories. In the South, many viewed the rise of the Republican Party as an attack on their way of life. Between 1850 and 1860, a series of events centered around the slavery controversy brought North and South to the brink of war. 1850. A federal Fugitive Slave Act was part of the Compromise of 1850 to balance out California entering the Union as a free state. This law made it easier for Southerners to recapture escaped slaves who were living in the North and made it illegal for Northerners to help them. The law became extremely unpopular in the North. 1852. Uncle Tom's Cabin was a best-selling novel written by Harriet Beecher Stowe. It was an emotional story with a strong anti-slavery message, and it changed the hearts and minds of Northerners who read it. Many readers finished the book believing as never before that slavery was an evil practice. 1854. The Kansas-Nebraska Act overturned an old law known as the Missouri Compromise, which had kept slavery out of much of the West. The new law allowed slavery in the new states to be created from the Western territories. This angered Northerners like Abraham Lincoln, an ex-congressman who re-entered politics as a result of this act's passage. 1856. Charles Sumner was an outspoken anti-slavery senator from Massachusetts. On the floor of the U.S. Senate, Sumner was savagely beaten with a cane by Preston Brooks, a Southern congressman who felt Brooks had insulted him and his family. In the South, Brooks was hailed by many as a hero, but in the North he was perceived as a villain. 1857. Dred Scott was a Missouri slave who sued for his freedom because he had spent years living in the North. His case went all the way to the Supreme Court, which ruled against Scott. Not only was he a slave, said the court, but black Americans like Scott lacked the basic rights of citizens, including the right to sue in court. 1859. John Brown was a radical abolitionist determined to end slavery by any means necessary. He led a violent raid on the federal weapons arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, hoping to arm freed slaves and start a race war. Brown's plot failed, and he was executed. But before his death, he left this grim warning for the future. I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away but with blood. 1860. In 1860, Lincoln was elected as the first Republican president of the United States. Lincoln had promised not to interfere with slavery where it already was, but because of his party's position, Southerners feared it was the beginning of the end. States like South Carolina now threatened secession from the Union. Secession is a word you don't hear too often unless you're learning about the Civil War. Secession is the act of seceding, when a part of a nation, like a state or province, formally withdraws from that nation in order to be politically independent. The original 13 United States seceded from Great Britain, in a sense, during the American Revolution. Several times before the Civil War, Southern states had threatened to secede over various political controversies. Occasionally, states in the North had threatened secession as well. The Constitution was and still is silent on the issue of secession. It doesn't allow states to secede and leave the Union, but it also doesn't forbid them from doing so. In December of 1860, a month after Lincoln's election, but several months before he would become president, South Carolina voted to secede from the United States. Nothing like it had ever happened in American history. Soon, 6 other states of the Deep South, including Florida, followed its lead. These states made it quite clear at the time that they were seceding to protect and preserve their right to own slaves. These 7 states declared themselves to be a new nation, the Confederate States of America. Abraham Lincoln, the newly elected president, faced the greatest crisis in our nation's history when he took the oath of office in 1861. Lincoln didn't want war, and he certainly didn't want to start one. At the same time, he was the elected president of the entire United States, and he couldn't allow the nation to split apart and to do nothing to stop it. Lincoln personally disliked slavery, and he didn't support it. At the same time, he had promised not to end slavery as president, and he recognized that it was legal under the Constitution. Lincoln decided to bide his time and let the Confederacy make the first move. If war was to come, he didn't want to be the one responsible. President Lincoln didn't have to wait long for war to begin. Just a month after his inauguration, in April 1861, Confederate forces in South Carolina attacked Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. The president could not ignore this attack on the U.S. Army. He called for 75,000 volunteers to form a Union army to put down the Southern Rebellion. In response, 4 more states, including Virginia, the most populous and important state in the South, joined the Confederacy. The Civil War had begun. Few thought the war would last long. Both the North and South were confident of an early victory and expected the other side to fold after 1 or 2 battles. It was not to be. Not only would the war last 4 horrible years, but the death toll would be catastrophic. Estimates vary, but historians agree that at least 620,000 soldiers from both sides lost their lives during the Civil War, possibly far more. This number represents more casualties than Americans suffered in our Revolutionary War, World War I, World War II, and the Vietnam War combined. You can probably see that the question, what caused the Civil War, is a complicated one with no single easy answer. But you can also probably see there is one central issue that connected the various causes in a way that led the nation to war. In the broadest possible sense, the politics of slavery caused the divisions that brought on the war. Almost all the respected historians agree on this. Some people claim that the Civil War wasn't really about slavery. It can be uncomfortable to acknowledge that slavery was so central to the American past. What these people probably mean is that since President Lincoln did not originally intend for the war to end slavery, the war wasn't about that issue. This view is both correct and incorrect. Lincoln's clearly stated purpose in 1861 was to save and reunite the Union, to end secession. But what caused the secession? It's hard to ignore the reality that 11 Confederate states formed a new nation primarily to protect their peculiar institution, slavery. Whatever Lincoln may have intended, the Civil War soon evolved into a conflict that did end slavery in all the United States forever.